Welcome to the Energetic Psyche, a weekly podcast hosted this week by Dr. Adrian Campbell and my illustrious co-host, Dr. Cacky Mellor. For episode 30, we'll be discussing what has been a large part of my academic work for the past 6 years, alchemy, and how we can use it to metaphorically view the process of individuation. I hope you enjoy. So welcome to the Energetic Psyche, hosted this week by Dr. Adrian Campbell and my illustrious co-host, Dr. Cacky Mellor. This week for episode 30, we will be discussing what has been a large part of my academic work for the past 6 years, alchemy, and how we can use it to metaphorically view the process of individuation. So, I know, right? Big stuff, big stuff. I'm very excited about this, though. Alchemy and the alchemical metaphor drew me in so deeply in the very first time we started learning about it during coursework at Pacifica. And it was one of those things I never realized that other people struggled to understand, because it was just it just made sense to me, right off the bat, Yeah. So I'm excited to talk about it. And I'm very excited to have you here with me to share in this conversation, because I think the more viewpoints we can get on alchemy, the better a chance we have of pinning parts of it down to be able to take a good look.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me again and for this really rich and provocative subject. I look forward to falling down this rabbit hole with you.
Yay. And that's, I think, the perfect image, starting with image, right? I mean, we were chatting a little bit before we came on about how when you work in alchemy, really there's a field that gets created. I mean, we're all within the field of psyche all the time, right? But alchemy is so full of metaphor and so full of image that it's impossible to even go near it without being willing to completely immerse yourself in that world and kind of let go of the boundaries that keep reality together, really.
Yeah. The phrase fall down the rabbit hole just kind of came out of my mouth, but Alice in Wonderland really is a alchemical journey, going deep into the depths of the unconscious to rediscover the self and emerge a new person.
Oh my gosh. I'm totally thinking of all the imagery. I'm thinking of the eat me tablets, the shrinking, the growing, the don't they end up in a river or just serious downpour?
She cries and she floods everything with her tears.
Right? I mean, I got goosebumps. Yes. So I bet there's a Jungian book written about this somewhere. I feel like someone has to have explored this already.
Right?
But so perfect metaphor to get us started. And so I kind of just wanted to, as much as we've read about this and studied it, I know that for a lot of people who may listen to this podcast or watch it, a lot of these terms are going to be really out there and might be hard to understand. So I'm going to do my best, as I always do, to take far out concepts and make them applicable and make them make sense to daily life. So the two big terms that we're working with today, the main umbrella ones, is individuation and alchemy. Yeah. Because this episode is all about looking at the process of individuation through the metaphorical lens of alchemy. Yeah. So let's start with, what is individuation? Because I think even that term, you and I already talked about these simple terms that just get thrown all over the place, used in the wrong way. And they end up with all of these definitions that don't make any sense and they get watered down, blah, blah, blah. And I think individuation is definitely one of those.
Yeah. I think individuation has gotten kind of a bad rap because it's misunderstood through this pop psych lens, the way that it's been thrown around, as you said. And it's often misunderstood as being selfish or someone who's very ego-centered and and about themselves,
Mhm.
when that is not at all what Carl Jung and depth psychology means with the term individuation.
Right. And the image that popped up for me when you were talking about that is like the Freudian couch. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's Freudian psychology, not Jungian psychology, but it's still depth.
Yes.
And the Freudian couch, that image of people with a lot of money laying on a couch talking about their problems, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And when I dug into kind of the background on the couch and why it was used, it really is so that the person can delve into their deeper self without having to stare at a person that's like asking them questions, right?
Yeah, trying to sidestep the shame of being in relationship, which is also hilarious to me and like says so much about Freud. But
yes.
yeah, we'll talk about that another time.
Another time, another episode, perhaps. But it's not selfish, because the more we work on ourselves, the better our world is, right? Like I talk to clients all the time about focusing on where you have control, especially right now with everything that's going on in the world, in our country, in the US. There's some messed up stuff going on, and it can seem really overwhelming. It can make you feel very helpless, like you don't have very much control. But at the end of the day, the one thing that you always have control over is yourself, right? And even if you don't have control over your own body for whatever reason, you still have control of what's going on up here. You get to choose how you're going to show up in the world, et cetera, et cetera. And so the process of individuation and the work that you do to build yourself up, to become better, stronger, clearer, the shadow work, which is bringing things out of the unconscious into the conscious mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
It just improves the collective as a whole. It improves the world as a whole. And the more people that do the work of individuation, the better we will all be,
Yeah. And this is going to be a bold statement, but I think that from my interpretation of Jung and James Hillman and Marion Woodman, who are like some of my core theorists that I look up to and admire, I understand that individuation is a responsibility that we have as individuals to become the best versions of ourselves in order to best be of service to the collective. It's not just about me wanting to, win a gold medal at the Olympics, which, hey, that's amazing if that's your path. It's not mine. But I am really, really interested in what are your unique gifts and how are you cultivating those and creating peace in yourself in order to really show up and do the work that we all need in order to thrive.
Right. And it's like in the coaching work that I do, we talk about like creating your best life, right? And doing the work to create your best life. But the thing is that even when that sounds selfish, if you're working to create a life that supports the best version of you, that best version of you is giving back to the world in how you're showing up energetically every single day. Right. So that's the big metaphorical, image-driven definition of individuation. But it really is like literally about digging into those parts of you that are not conscious, doing what, people call shadow work, which has become, a term that everyone loves.
Yes.
Yeah, bandy about. And the shadow is not necessarily bad, right? Doing shadow work is not bad. When something's in the shadow, it just means that it's not in the light, right? It can't be seen. So it's in the unconscious mind. And what we're doing through the process of individuation is bringing that stuff up from the unconscious so that we can look at it and decide what to do with it. Do we like it? Do we want to keep it? Do we want to give it back? Do we need to transform it somehow so that it serves us better, serves our community better? it's big work, it's hard work, it's difficult. And that's why, you know, in Jungian psychology space or depth psychology, we talk about it as a lifelong process.
Yeah.
Like the process of individuation isn't like, I'm going to go to therapy for a year and I'll be individuated. Yay. It's
only
right. It's one of those things where, like, you know, you see the memes or the reels or whatever on social media about like, I totally thought I was evolved and I had dealt with all this, and then boom, it hits again. And I mean, and I've been in that space where I'm like, God, I thought I healed this. Like, how am I back? Because it's this cycle, it's a process. A really interesting man, what is his name? Michael Mirdad. He's a spiritual teacher out in Sedona, but he offered the image of like when you're on this cycle, right, of healing, it isn't like a flat circle, but rather like a spiral. Yes. Like those springy Christmas trees, right? That go up and down. And so every time you hit that certain spot on the spiral, you're hitting the same thing that needs to be healed, but you're doing it from an elevated place.
Yeah. And an expanded growth place.
Yes. So if you're doing the work, even though you're hitting it again and again and again, you're going to be hitting it in a different way. You're going to have more tools to deal with it and process it. And hopefully this time it'll be a shorter span of time and won't be as terrible, right? Like that's the goal anyway. And so really that's what individuation is from my perspective, is looking at all of that, working with it, facing it, which we'll talk about when we get into the stages of alchemy, and figuring out where to go from there. Is there anything you would want to add to that?
Yeah, I think agency is coming up for me as you're talking, because by intentionally cultivating a relationship with the unconscious and bringing those things into the light, into conscious awareness, we have choice, we have agency. It opens up that space, which is both a really exciting and terrifying place to be, because then the responsibility really is on us of who do I want to be? How do I want to show up? And yeah, it's not for the faint of heart. We'll say that.
Yeah. And when we get into Slutio, I'm going to bring that up again, right? Because that agency is so important, because you do get to choose. The process of individuation may start without your permission. That is very possible. Yeah. But you get to choose if you're going to go on this journey, you know, just like the hero's journey. Are you going to say yes to this adventure? You know, are you ready to make these huge changes and shifts in your life or not? No judgment, right? I mean, no judgment, but you get to make that choice. So yeah, I think that's a great point, Cacky, is agency. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. And so then the other big term is alchemy itself, right? I'm going to focus really on the way that we use it in Jungian psychology, but I will touch on alchemy just a teeny bit. So my dad was a chemist, right? And he and I see alchemy very differently. When I started talking about it, he was like, oh, alchemy, yes, the father of chemistry, like blah, 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 blah. And I was like, well, yeah, we use it really differently in Jungian psychology. And he's like, it's chemistry. I'm like, but it's not. And we had this whole moment for like 30 minutes and we never met. Yes. Right. So ancient alchemy, and I'm talking like
medieval time.
Yeah. Like that, a couple of thousand years BC. Right. Mm-hmm. Ancient alchemy, the people who did it, the alchemists, were like magicians. They were like magical. And this is back when spirit and psyche and the body were all still one thing. We were not these separated out pieces, right? Looked at by different types of doctors and things like that. It was just, this is the human condition. And they often worked with physical substances, which led to the creation of the science of chemistry, right? Sulfur, mercury, silver, all this. Yes. And they did different experiments. And through these experiments, they didn't work in a straight logical way, but they worked in image. And these images were like code. So like none of their notes were reasonably written or made any kind of sense to people that weren't alchemists. Let's see if I can show a picture here. This is one of my favorite books when it comes to alchemy. Get it on camera. Anatomy of the Psyche. It's by Edward Edinger. I've used it in so much of the work that I've done, and he has some alchemical images in here. If you're watching live or you watch this on YouTube, you'll be able to see these examples I'll show.
While you're finding that, I'll just add that a big part of why so much of the information about alchemy is through image is because the power of the alchemical process was seen as so dangerous to have just out there for anyone to use, that they coded it to protect it and to keep it from falling into the wrong hands or being destroyed by folks who were threatened by the power of the alchemical process.
Absolutely. And I think it also lends a sacredness to it in that way too. Like when I teach Reiki, with the Reiki symbols, until you're attuned to them, they're a secret. Yeah. So here's 2 images. Ooh, there we go. Lots going on there, but that's essentially an alchemical instruction, right? And here's one more. Whoop.
Oh, yes.
Yes, Mama Earth. And there's a couple great ones. If you're really interested in alchemical art, I suggest you Google it, look online. There's some beautiful ones. The sulfur, the sun, the lion eating the king. Those are some of my favorites. But yeah, they're beautiful. But anyway, so alchemists, thank you. Alchemists from way back in the day used these drawings and stuff to, like we've said, to kind of disguise what was going on in the processes and procedures. But it was also because what they were studying wasn't just the chemistry of the actual processes, but they were studying the process of individuation in the human experience, how we move through the world, the different cycles that we go through, what matters to us. And so not just how do you turn this crap into gold, but how do you take a human who's experiencing their world through the lens of, we'll say, crap, right? Or prima materia, and bring them to a place of gold, right? Their inner experience can become gold, can become light. And as the world shifted and changed, the science of chemistry was created out of alchemy. And then for a very long time, the rest of that stuff kind of laid to the wayside. And then Carl Jung came along and was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. This is a great way for us to explore the process of individuation through metaphor. So I have a quote from Carl Jung here that explains alchemy as a concretization in projected and symbolic form of the process of individuation. And it is just such a beautifully complete way to look at how we process the different things we're going through. And like I mentioned earlier, when I first came into alchemy in the class, I think it was Tina that taught it, Tina Stromstead. I just fell in love with it, just absolutely fell in love with it. And Edinger speaks of it as, and this is a direct quote, a kind of anatomy of individuation. Like you mentioned, a map, right?
Yeah.
To help us understand the process. And so in Jungian psychology and depth psychology, we use the alchemical metaphor, not the scientific chemistry side of it, but the metaphor to help us understand the process of individuation.
Yes, beautifully said. It's such a kind of ethereal concept.
Yeah.
If you don't understand it, and it does take being introduced to it, I think, to recognize it as that map, as that recognizable set of patterns, and really a key to, okay, this is where you're at in the map, then you go up this mountain and down this mountain and turn left at the lake and you'll be at Salutio.
Right? And you're like, wait, what? They're like, just trust me. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. Just do it. Just go.
Just dissolve. It's fine.
Yeah. And I think like along the lines of what you're saying is there has to be like a letting go of reason.
Yeah.
There has to be a letting go of like this logical way of looking at things. One of the quotes that I pulled actually from Edinger. Let me see if I can. Oh, here we go. And he's talking about separatio, the process of separatio, but he says, people who have nothing but the sharp blade of rational intellect with which to understand their sensitive soul life, their self-examination is a perpetual torture of self-dissection.
Woo.
Right?
Yeah.
And I love that one because it just reminds me again that we need to give ourselves grace as we go through these processes. We need to be able to look at things with curiosity instead of judgment, to allow these images to breathe and live and move and be fluid and flexible versus static or stagnant, labeled as this is what that is, because then we kill it all, and like you said, the sharp blade. Oh, yes. So when you want to work with the alchemical metaphor, and I'll even go so far as to say, really, this is just like jumping off the deep end with images, right? Like if you want to work with image, you have to be willing to let go a little bit of all those boundaries that we're taught to hold so tightly to when it comes to rational thought.
And it takes trust to do that. It takes trust and a sense of containment within something that's greater than me as one small being on this earth, to know that this process, as much as my prefrontal cortex wants to make sense of things and wants to understand it and wants to control the process, like, it's very humbling to go through an alchemical transformation and to recognize how small me and my ego and what I understand to be important is in relationship to, again, this larger collective, and the centuries of experience of the alchemical process that have come before us and that will continue on well after us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think trust, like you said, is so important because we never know when one of these cycles is going to get kicked off.
Yeah.
We don't know how long they might last. I myself was in a Salutio cycle for like a year, maybe a little longer. And I just remember being like, oh man, we're still doing this, huh? Yeah. Okay, that's cool. And it is very much a trust that like, it's going to get better. It's going to get better. Like, we just got to ride this out. And that's where I think having information about the alchemical metaphor can be so important, because like I was able to identify like, oh, I'm in Salutio right now. And like, it makes perfect sense that I'm feeling this, this, and this, that I'm experiencing this, this, and this. Like, okay. Right? Yeah. And when we're not conscious of that, it can be terrifying. I mean, honestly, even if we are, it can be a little terrifying. I'm not gonna lie, but it helps, I think.
It does help. And I think it also, there's a sense of recognition. Like, even if this experience is unfamiliar to me this time, there's a familiarity that this has happened before, either in my own experience or in, millions of people's experiences, and to be able to lean into the wisdom of the process and all of those that have come before in the process.
Right, because even if this is a process that you kind of have to go through on your own, right? You're not alone, because so many people are going through it at the same time and have gone through it before you and will go through it after. So, like and I'm sure I've shared this metaphor with you. I look at the collective unconscious or as the ocean, right? And our cultural unconscious is like a harbor or a bay, and then the individual as the tide pool.
Yeah.
And even as the tide pool is going through its process, there are tide pools all along that harbor doing the same thing, all around the world doing the same thing, and all these harbors that are going through their process, that's happening all over. So yeah, we're not alone in this. Like, it's something that we're all experiencing in a different way, possibly, but at the same time. Yes, I'm going to stop talking because I think that's it.
Yeah. Well, and it's not just limited to human companions.
Yeah.
Because each of the stages, as we'll talk about, has an element that's connected to it as well. So you're also companioned by this elemental force.
Right. Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's get into the phases here.
Yay.
So yes. So I'm bringing forward today 7 stages of alchemy. There are more, or I will say there can be more, depending on how deep and where you want to go with this. You can go in a lot of different directions. I have been working with this in different ways in my research for about 6 or 7 years now. And so these are the 7 stages that I have found make the most sense when it comes to me looking at the process of individuation, and are the simplest, I think, to view things through. So I'll just mention each of them, and then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about each of it individually, I think. But we're already almost halfway through the hour. I don't, I just talk and talk. So we're going to do the best we can. Okay, so the 7 stages that we're going to talk about tonight are calcinatio. This is all in Latin, folks. It's all in Latin. The names anyway. But you can use it. English would be calcination, right? So calcinatio is Latin. Calcination is English. Solutio, or solution. To dissolve. I think I like that word better than solution. Solutio, dissolution. Coagulatio, to coagulate or coagulation. Sublimatio, sublime, sublimination. Mortificatio, mortification, also known as death. Separatio, to separate or separation. And then conjunctio, it's the bringing together, right? All right. So as I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, we don't always know which phase is going to start us out. Yeah. It's nice, and we love to have these like logical ways of looking at things. But even the alchemists back in the day knew that that's not real life. Yeah. So when you read these books, if you go by the Anatomy of Psyche, just a heads up, it's going to take a little work getting in there and being like, what? Because they talk in circles and kind of in riddles, and it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that, because that's real life. Like, you don't progress through these logical steps, and I think that's some of that where like mainstream psychology lets us down, is they try to force our lives into these boxes and steps, and it's not really what happens. So for the sake of ease of understanding, we'll start at calcinatio. Perfect. Calcination, which is the process of purification through fire. Okay. This is often a starting point for people's process or for a cycle of individuation, I will say, because it's when shit hits the fan, right? It's when life goes sideways and all of a sudden everything you loved is being burned away or taken away from you. Depending on we'll say the size or the intensity of this individuation cycle for you, it will be more or less. So it could be something as simple as leaving home and going to college for the first time, right? There's a lot of loss involved in that, a burning away, if you will. It could be a divorce. That's a huge transformation. And both of these things, you know, even if you have a say in them, you may not necessarily be ready for the transformation that's coming.
Right.
And so calcinadio is kind of the beginning of that. It's the burning away, and this is a quote from Edinger, of all such luxurious pleasures and earthly loves, the things that make you comfortable, the things that you've relaxed into. These are the habits, right, that may not be the best for you, but they're comfortable. You know them, you love them, you're in that space. And then the world goes whoomph,
Yeah.
and everything's on fire.
Yeah. Yeah. I've kind of thought of it as when your life is kind of going along and you're almost in like autopilot, and then this curveball comes in, and then everything just feels too rigid and like it doesn't quite fit anymore.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can be really dramatic changes, and sometimes it can just be like, well, you know, that title doesn't fit anymore. Like I don't identify as what I used to identify as.
Yep. And so in the subtle changes like that, it's the beginnings of getting rid of.
Yes.
Right. It's the burning away of what no longer belongs. And one of the things Edinger talks about in this stage as well is, to quote, the drying out of waterlogged unconscious complexes, which bring forward thoughts, deeds, and memories that carry shame, guilt, and anxiety. So, yeah.
I don't know about you, but I don't have any of that.
Nobody says, right? We're all perfect. But it's through like this burning away that we do have the beautiful opportunity for our shadow elements to start coming to the forefront, right? For these complexes to start raising up out of, like he says, the waterlogged complexes that have been like buried for so long. The fire clears that away, brings them to the surface, so we can start to look, and at least in this stage, we're just bringing awareness to the fact that something isn't right. Something needs to change, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's something here.
Yes, yes. And so often, but not always, the phase that can follow this is solutio, the dissolution of self, essentially, right? And as these things are coming forward and you're like, God, this doesn't really fit anymore. I don't know what I'm doing in my life. I don't know what I'm doing in my life is where we start moving into solutio, because yourself, your image of self, your concept of self, your ego starts to dissolve, right? And depending on the strength of your own personal ego at this point, and I'm talking about ego from a psychology standpoint right now, not spiritual. Okay. Very different, folks. But depending on the strength of that ego, this can feel relaxing, like a welcome surrender. Like, God, I was done being that person anyway. Ugh, right? What's next? Or if you were really solid in who you were, it can actually feel like an annihilation of self. Yes. And I think, you know, the two examples I gave earlier of like leaving for college could feel like a welcome surrender, right? Like, I'm done being this kid. I don't want to be, you know, a child anymore. I'm ready to grow up. And so I'm going to let all of this kind of fall apart so that I can figure out who I am, right? Whereas with a divorce, that can end up being like, no, like I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this. You know, a very centered and strong ego may have a really hard time in the dissolution phase and can feel very lost. And it's actually one of the places that becomes really dangerous for people if it is a very traumatic shift and they don't get help, because it can honestly feel like an annihilation of self and can lead to suicide. Yeah. You know? So it's a big deal. I also wanted to talk about another dangerous thing in this space, which is where I've spent a good amount of my research on is when we're in this space and we're kind of dissolving, we don't really know who we are anymore. It can be very scary. If we have, I hate using the term weaker ego. They say it in the books, but I feel like, so if we have a less strong ego or a less centered or firm ego.
More impressionable?
Impressionable could work. Yeah. So if we're going through this salutio phase and we're like, it's cool. Like, I wanted to change anyway. I'm just going to dissolve a little bit, see what happens. Right. Yeah. If you're in that space, but you start noticing that, or let's say you're in that space and you, in real life, like this is really a thing that's happening, right? You also happen to be spending a lot of time around someone that has a very large and overwhelming viewpoint. Okay. They can actually infiltrate your process and contaminate your mixture if you allow them to do so. Like I talk about this a lot in my research with military, because that's what they do in boot camp. Is during your dissolution, the military collective consciousness comes in and is like, you belong to us. And you're like, okay, I'm really weak right now because you're beating the crap out of me every day. And I don't even know who I am anymore because I don't have my own clothes. And it just kind of happens. But it also happens in religious groups. It happens in political groups. It happens, honestly, anytime a person is feeling a little lost. And often a little scared when another force comes in, another person, group, etc., and is like, I can give you the answer. I can solve your problem. It becomes very dangerous for that individual's individuation process because they can easily be wrapped up in that other viewpoint.
Yeah. So even thinking about like going off to college, if you are joining a sorority or a fraternity and being hazed and going through, I don't know anything about that process, but going through that process, and it can really be where you lose yourself. Like you lose that individual identity and you latch on to group think because who am I anyway? So this is here. This must be good enough.
And they seem strong and they seem stable. And, often it's when it's so all encompassing that it's easier to surrender to that than to do the hard work. Because the hard work in Salutio is, who am I? Right? Like as we start to dissolve away and we see all of these pieces of us floating around, it's okay. What am I going to let go of? And what am I going to hold on to? Who do I want to be in this cycle, right? Because during Calcinadio, we burned all this stuff away. A bunch of complexes came forward. There may be some really ugly stuff there that we don't want to confront or look at. And so in Salutio, there's a lot of courage involved and a lot of allowing, because sometimes that process takes a while, right? For things to shift and sort out. The image that keeps coming to my mind is like of a ship that like explodes or burns down in the ocean. And there's all these floating parts. What are we going to take with us? And what are we going to leave? Right. And so once we make that decision, then we can move into the next stage, which is coagulatio, where we start to decide, or where we've decided this is who I want to be. Let's try it out.
Here's these pieces. Let's see how they fit together.
Right, exactly. So was there anything else you wanted to add about Salutio before we move on?
No, that's perfect.
Awesome. Okay. And so we've decided who we want to be. We have these pieces, right? And we move forward into coagulatio, or coagulation in English. We're bringing together. Blah. The word coagulatio just seems very like gooey, right? Like pieces. Yes. And they talk about in this phase is it's like a cooking, a kneading, a hammering. This is work, like coaguladio is work. This is not the like kickback phase. Not that any of it is, to be honest. But this is honestly when people hire coaches most of the time, because they're like, this is the idea of who I want to be, right? But I'm not sure 100% how to get there. Yeah. And so in this phase, we get clear about what these pieces are, who you want to be, and then how can you practice being that person? How can you start moving towards that? And it's, you know, in the book Atomic Habits, it talks about like everything you do, every little action is a vote towards who you want to be, right? Every step matters. Everything you do matters. And it's physical practice. So it's like literally like, let's say you're like, I want to be healthier. I'm going to be a healthier person. And it's like, well, what does that mean? In this stage, we got to define it. We got to figure out what that means for you. And maybe it means eating better and exercising so that you have more strength in your body. Mm-hmm. And so the actual practical steps of that would be learning how to grocery shop. Yeah. Cooking your own food, if that's what you decide, going to the gym and actually like doing the exercises that are going to give you the body that you'll be happy with. Right. And then there's also the less physical, but more, what's the word I'm looking for? Intangible skills, like our values and our beliefs that go along with these new parts of us. Mm-hmm. And we have to practice those too. Like someone who decides not to drink alcohol anymore and has become sober. It's not just the physical act of not drinking. There are beliefs that are in alignment with that. There are values that may shift or be strengthened, shored up because of this decision, right? Mm-hmm. And so every time you're deciding not to have a drink, you're also practicing those intangible shifts in self as well.
Yeah. And I'll add in the social relational layer as well, because it's not just your individual acts, it's how you are. Like if you're used to spending all weekend being a couch potato in bed rot, as my students would say, like if that's your friend group and then you're trying to shift to get out and go hiking every weekend, that's going to have an effect on not just your choices, but how you're interacting with those close to you.
And I think that's such an important point. Because again, so much of this can become this like intangible like idea, right? But in this phase, that is the kind of stuff that gets hard. As we move out of solutio and we're like, this is who I want to become, you have to remember you are in a community. You do have friends and family. There are people around you. You know, one of the things I work with clients a lot on is being able to discuss and talk about the changes that they're going through, why they're going through them, and how people can support them, right? So that as like, if you do have a house full of roommates that like to hang out and do bed rot, right? If they love you, if they care about you, and you say, look, this is important to me. This is what I want to do differently with my life. And this is how you can support me.
Yeah.
Right? Who that cares about you is going to be like, that's dumb. No, like that doesn't happen. Right. And if they do, maybe it's time to find some new friends, you know? And so there's kind of an external separatio that happens through this, right?
Very
not just internal. Yep.
Yes. That discernment is mirrored internal and external.
Yep. Absolutely. Because after coagulatio, we go into sublimatio, right? And like I was saying earlier when we were chatting, this is the one phase that I'm always like, how do you talk about this in like real people words? Yeah. Because it is so ethereal and like I feel it in my spirit, but to use words is so difficult. So I pulled a few quotes from Edinger, and he talks about sublimatio as the alchemical operation that transforms the material being worked on, so the person, right, and the stuff that we're working on, into air by volatilizing and elevating it. And that psychologically, sublimation or sublimatio creates the conditions needed for our egos to learn how to see themselves and their world objectively, to strive to present life in terms of eternal forms and universal ideas. And this helps bring shape to the other. Okay. What is us and what is not? Everything that we've decided in these phases until now is us, right? And we get to decide what it's kind of like, what are our favorite parts and which ones are not. And we take all of these and we put them up into the heavens and we're like, look at how beautiful they are. And there they are compared to everybody else, right? And then we notice that maybe all the parts didn't make it up there. And maybe all the parts aren't that beautiful and exalted. And help me if you think I'm explaining this wrong, or if there's a better way, because this is like I said, this one is difficult for me. But we put them up into the world, we exalt this stuff, and then there's certain things that end up down here, right? That don't quite make it up. And Edinger talks about those as being things that have become earth or flesh and is thus subject to death and corruption.
Yeah.
Parts of us that we are not always so comfortable with.
Yeah, there's one of my favorite alchemical images talks about this, and it is of a dove taking flight, and the dove has a like shackle around it, and there's a chain, and on the other end of the chain is another shackle that's around a toad. And so this dove is trying to take flight and really like has their eyes on the heavens. Yes. And then they're being anchored and weighed down by this toad that, while it can, get a little air in a hop,
right? Exactly.
It's not going to the heavens. Like it is very much earthbound.
I got it.
Yes. Yes.
That's the image.
That's the image. So it's this tension that is created between this force that's rising up that wants to take flight and this very grounded opposing force that's anchoring it. And then we're like, okay, am I up? Am I down? Both of these things are me.
Yep. And that leads to what is called participation mystique, right? Being stuck in the in-between, which is a whole nother thing we're not going to get into today. But yes. And so as we're trying to push up and we get stuck down here, right? Because not all of us is at that point where we're like, whoa, oh, holy, and all that. And this is also another dangerous space because we need to look at those parts of us that are not exalted. We need to accept that they are still us. And this is where, again, that courage comes in, that we may not like what we see. And the agency you spoke of, right? Of like taking responsibility for that and owning it and deciding what we're going to do with it, you know? And some of it we may keep and move on with, and others we will not, right? Which takes us to the next phase, separatio. Okay. So in separatio, that's where we start to like bring awareness to these two parts of us and really make those decisions of what am I going to accept as me and what am I not? What do I want to keep? What do I want to get rid of? Edinger calls it facing the injured or underdeveloped aspects of one's personality. Okay. So it's not like bad things about you. I really encourage people to let go of the good and the bad and just say, this is what's going on. You know, this is what I got. Is it serving me? Is it not?
Yeah.
Is this how I want to show up? Or would I prefer to show up differently? Right.
Yeah. And a lot of it has to do with dose too, where there can be benefits and detrimental aspects of all parts of ourselves. And often it's about dialing into just that right dose where it's medicine rather than poison.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And the biggest danger in this phase is not allowing those opposites to exist within you.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the things, and this is where we move a little bit into spirituality, right? And this is why I love depth psychology, because we're all over the place. We got energy, we got spirit, we got science. But when we can get to a point where we see that everything that is outside of us also exists within us, yes. Right? Every beautiful part of us has the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's light and there's shadow. There's good and there's evil, you know? And when we refuse to accept that anything evil could exist within us, when we refuse to accept that anything we don't like or that we're not comfortable with exists within us, that all becomes other. And we project it out into the world. And that's why, you know, I tell people, most of what other people think about you is none of your business. And 99.999% of the time, whatever people say to you is their own shit. It's their own complexes. It's their own issues that they're just projecting out into the world all over the place. Even when you're doing the work, still do it. I still do it. I mean, I catch myself projecting all the time. Not all the time, but, you know, sometimes it happens.
It's very human. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it's uncomfortable to sit with the contradiction and where we are hypocrites, because we all contain the full continuum, as you were saying. And I always think of the Walt Whitman quote, if I'm a hypocrite, very well, like I'm a hypocrite, I am a universe, I contain multitudes. And I think that perspective can give us a lot of grace in opening up to that acceptance of all of who we are, not just the convenient parts.
Well, and as we do that work, it allows us to be more kind with others.
Yes.
Right. And this is where that quote that I talked about in the beginning, the people who have nothing but the sharp blade of rational intellect, right, with which to understand their sensitive soul life. Mm-hmm. And when we're doing that to ourselves, we project that out on others as well. And you see it through the way that we judge other people, the statements, the labels, the shaming, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, all of that is our shit, but we're refusing to accept it within ourselves. And so it has to be pushed out through other. And so that primarily happens during separatio, or can happen, right? Is what are we keeping as ours? And can we really own all of this? And then moving from separatio into mortificatio, mortification or death, is where we get rid of things, right? And they talk a lot about mortificatio is like a destroying or a getting rid of, but it really is a process of transformation.
Yes.
You know, and like when we work with death in dreams, in an image, you know, it's one of the scariest types of dreams you can have, I think, is when your dreams involve death, especially people you care about, things that are close to you. And I'm always telling people, I'm like, it's transformation. Some kind of change needs to happen here. And so we go through separatio and we're like, oh, you know, like sublimatio was like, this is amazing, this not so much. And then we're like, but I'm going to decide to own it both. I'm going to own all of it. And so then in mortificatio, it's okay. What am I going to do with this crap I don't like? Like, what am I going to do with it? Am I going to project it out onto others and say this doesn't belong to me? Or am I going to take agency and responsibility and say, I'm going to do the work to transform this so that when I go through my next cycle, right, more gets to move up. Yeah. So that's how I see mortificatio. What about you?
Yeah, this is the, you know, putrid leaves being turned into fertilizer for the tree the following year. This is the phoenix burning to the ashes, and surrendering to that so that it can be reborn. It's not the reborn part yet, but it's almost there. It's that part where you really like it is all rotting away and giving into that death and completing of that part of the cycle so that the rebirth can come forward, because we need death in order to have life. We'll talk about that later too.
Exactly. And that's the thing, is when we run from that, right? We're like, ooh, death is scary. No, I want everything to be alive forever.
Yeah.
We're doing a huge disservice to ourselves, especially from like a psychological standpoint, because if anything big is going to change in your life, if you want anything extreme to happen, right? If you have this big dream and these goals and all this stuff, but you're not willing to let go of not everything, but you're not willing to let go of things that you have,
Yeah.
how are you going to get there? Like, it's not going to work out. Like, there has to be change. There has to be a death. There has to be a transformation. I say this all the time. Energy cannot be destroyed. All it can do is be shifted or transmuted. So what do you want to do with it? Right?
Yeah.
And it can be easy to shift the blame for a minute. That's okay. Project. But it doesn't serve you. And if you're really looking for that big rebirth and those huge changes, then you have to transform, right? You have to allow the death to occur. Yeah.
And there is so much effort that goes into projecting.
Yeah.
There's a lot of effort in alchemy in general, but I think that's often we don't realize how much energy we are expending to keep things the way that they are.
It's exhausting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what's crazy, is that like the thought of surrendering is terrifying, right? Just like in dissolution, you're watching yourself just dissolve and you're like, no. And you want to like keep all this stuff. But the more you grab, the heavier you get, you know? And it's the threat of sinking. It's the threat of losing yourself completely if you don't allow for the dissolution to take place. You know, fighting transformation, fighting a necessary death. I mean, that's where the nightmares come from. If you have a nightmare, it's probably because Psyche's been like, hello, trying to talk to you, hello. And you're like, la, 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 I don't hear you. And Psyche's like, oh yeah, you hear that? Right? Because you can't fight that energy forever. And, you know, it's one of those things, it takes courage to get to a point where you can allow that. And there's grief in that, and there is sadness in that. And, you know, I think it's important to remember through all of these stages, depending on what you're going through, there is going to be a grief in a lot of these, because you're losing a part of who you were. You're having to make very difficult decisions about how you want to move forward in the world and how you want to show up. And I think we overgrandize this as this beautiful, wonderful experience. And it's hard, and it can hurt and be wonderful at the same time.
Yeah, there's absolutely suffering at the core of the alchemical process. Like, that is the prima materia. That is the shit that we are so obsessed with in depth psychology, because that shit, that suffering through this alchemical process, we can transform it, we can transmute it into really beautiful growth. That doesn't mean the suffering wasn't there and wasn't real. It very much is.
But there's beauty in suffering. Yes.
There's beauty, and there's meaning, and there's purpose.
Yeah.
Not to over romanticize it, but like it's both and.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's totally fine to romanticize it, because we unromanticize regularly in this culture, and we need more romance. And all the things we say and read and think and see, art, beauty, color, and that can all exist within suffering, which is wild, right? But so true. So our final phase, conjunctio, the rebirth, the joining, right? Yes. Oh, perfect. this is all of those parts that we've decided we're going to keep, that we've worked on, right? And then we've been, okay, this is amazing. This, not so much. Okay, we're going to own it. We're going to transmute, transform, and the birth, right? The phoenix coming back up from the flames into this newly emerged form. Beautiful.
Yeah.
You know, I think of with everyone just talking about suffering, this is that like the laughing, happy, exhausted cry phase. We're like, oh my God, I made it. This is amazing. Maybe like the end of a marathon or something where you're just like, is it over? It's really okay, cool.
Yeah.
And it's not the end. I mean, that's the thing. Like we mentioned in the beginning, this is a little cycle, and there will be another and another and another and another, and they just keep going as we work through things. And then we have the grand cycle, right? And so we have the lesser, this would be like the examples we've been giving would be like lesser conjunctios. It's just, you know, learning and evolving little by little, and then hoping for the grand opus at the end, the final conjunctio, you know, or in a lot of spiritual spaces, what they would call enlightenment. Yeah, very similar.
Yeah.
But yeah,
that place of coming to integration and wholeness, just for the process to begin all over again.
But don't worry, there's usually a break in between. You know, like I say, you finish the marathon, go sit in the hot tub, have some orange slices, do what you gotta do.
But as soon as you're comfortable.
Oftentimes. But as someone who has now consciously done this a couple of times, I'm so grateful that I'm more conscious of it. Like I said, this last one, when I was in the solutio, and like right now I'm actually in a coagulatio phase, like very much. I'm getting close to the next one, but I'm still there. That solutio, man, it was like a year long. I got to tell you, about 6 months in, I'm like, shit, seriously? Like we're still doing this. Okay. And it was a little scary. But because of the knowledge I have and the support systems that I have, like my Jungian therapist, right? And beautiful, wonderful friends that I can talk art and image with and dream. I got through it a lot easier, I think, than I would have 10 years ago. Yeah. And it's just every cycle, I think you have an opportunity to increase your awareness. And like we were talking about, the spiral going up versus a flat circle. You know, it gets easier.
I love that. And what's coming forward as you're talking is also your resources grow each time around that spiral. So you're not only your wisdom and your experience and your recognition of the phases, but your incredible community and support. And we each are constantly having an opportunity to strengthen and grow that community more and more through this process, to really discern, like, who are my people? What is my community? Like, how do I want to show up and be in relationship, be interdependent? And that gets to grow with us too. So not only are we maybe bumping up against some of the same challenges, we're coming at it with new experience and this incredible growing expanse of resources, again, because we're not alone.
I was just going to say, because bringing it back to that community or communal, right, mind frame is that as you evolve and you go through these and you reach out to your resources, or you hang out with people in your life, spend time with those that you love or care for, even people you don't, maybe they're people at work, whatever, you know, like as you're continuing to move up this spiral and your energy is shifting, you're impacting everyone around you.
Yeah.
So yes, individuation is an individual process. And I will be honest, you may not ever feel as alone as you do during some of these processes, because it's necessary to get to the true essence of who you are. But you are always connected. You are always impacting and impacted by everyone and everything around you. And so it's just important to remember that, like, I mean, you're not alone ever, and there's always, even when it feels like it, there's always someone or something out there that you matter to, and that whatever. Yeah. You matter to, and they matter to you. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And that you can always reach out for help. And there are so many resources, and different resources might be appropriate for different points in your alchemical process, or who you are and your preferences. But it's actually part of that courage that you were describing, to reach out and to ask for help, to get a therapist, to get a coach, to, have those candid conversations with folks that you're in relationship with, to be like, this is what I need your support with. Can you do that for me? No? Okay, bye.
Right. Well, and sometimes those resources are as simple as like a gym buddy, right? Yeah. Or someone that does meal prep or helps you organize your house or your closet, like, this is the thing with this, is that we can go huge on image, or we can like bring it back down, and this is real life, like everyday stuff. It's just another way of looking at it. Yeah. So with that, we are definitely at time. So I think we did a great job, though. I feel like we covered what we wanted to. I mean, with alchemy, we did a great job. We reined it in, because we could talk about this stuff for hours.
Yes.
Yeah. So if you're watching and listening, whether it's live or on the podcast, or on Spotify or YouTube, I hope you enjoyed it. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the comments, and we'll answer as much as we can. And I'm also just going to tap on the fact that I'm teaching a class at Pacifica through their Pacifica Graduate Institute in their extension program. It's online. It's 4 sessions, 90 minutes each, and it starts September 18th, and it's every Wednesday in the evenings, Pacific time. So you'll have to look at the website to look for sure. I think it's 5 or 5:30 Pacific. But it's called Warriors and Liminality. It's based on a paper that I published a couple years ago through the Jungian Society of Scholarly Studies, their journal. But the course examines all the stages of boot camp through the alchemical lens, kind of like we did today, but just looking at how individuals are processed into the military through those stages. And then what happens to us when we get out. And that second cycle starts, right, of separation, and the different areas and stages we get stuck in. That leads to veteran dis-ease, right? Keeps us from being able to heal our trauma. So if you're a vet and you want to learn more about your own process from a psychological lens, a Jungian lens, metaphorical lens, check it out. The link is on my website, energeticpsyche.com, and I'll post it with this.
Yeah, as well. in the show notes.
So I will. And if you're a therapist that wants to work with military or veterans, I highly recommend it. And we're offering CEUs with it as well. So, all right. That's all I have to say. Cacky, did you have anything to add before we wrap up?
I just want to second your plug for this course. I know I've gotten to witness how much work you have put into this course, into this paper, and into your dissertation, because this is all connected with your dissertation. So there are years and years and years of research and study and scholarship that is going into this. And it promises to be incredibly transformational.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. All right. Well, we'll say good night. Goodbye. Thanks for joining us, everyone. And I hope you have a great rest of your week. Ciao.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Energetic Psyche, a weekly podcast that live streams every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I look forward to you joining us in the future. Have a great week.